in History. This is where I go over 4 events that happened this week in the past, local, national, world, and some fun pop culture. So let's dive right into it. This week in history, 71 years ago, on January 17th, 1950, the crime of the century happened in the North End of Boston. This crime was the robbery in the North End at 165 Prince Street, which is actually less than a quarter mile from the Great Molasses Flood that I spoke about on last week's podcast, ironically, really close by. So the nuts and bolts of it are at 7:30 p.m., a group of between 5 and 7 masked and armed robbers robbed this Brinks building. All of the robbers had these weird sort of Halloween masks on, and the employees were bound and gagged with tape on the floor. It was seen as kind of odd that they did very little talking and moved with such precision. It was like they had rehearsed this for months before actually going on to do it. So when they were looting the place, a buzzer went off that signified that someone wanted to get into the vault, and it was a garage attendant, and that kind of set things off. The garage attendant was lucky, though, because he ended up not coming in, and 2 of the robbers went to apprehend him, so he actually got away. In the end, the masked robbers got away with cash and checks and more that totaled about $30 million when adjusted for inflation. There was a $100,000 reward offered for any info, and there were hundreds of dead ends in trying to apprehend any of these robbers. The investigation lasted years, and actually it came up about 5 days before the statute of limitations was going to run out in January 1956. 5 members of the gang were arrested, with 3 more being arrested within the next few months. The 8 received life sentences in prison for their actions in the robbery, with all but 1 being paroled in 1971. And not surprisingly, only $58,000 of the money that was taken in the robbery was ever recovered. If you want to learn more about that robbery, there was a book written called The Men Who Robbed Brinks, released in 1961. It was written by Bob Considine, and he actually had help from a former gang member, Joseph Specs O'Keefe. This week in history, 212 years ago, January 19th, 1809, Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston. Poe was a giant in the American literary scene. He was mostly known for his poetry and short stories. That's kind of how he got started. His first book was an anonymous collection called Tamerlane and Other Poems that he released in 1827. For those that might not be familiar with Edgar Allan Poe, his most famous works are Fall of the House of Usher from 1839, The Telltale Heart from 1843, and perhaps his most famous work, The Raven, from 1845. He was one of the first people to try to make a full-time living as a writer, and he was easily one of the most influential writers of the 19th century, and his contributions as far as mystery and horror still stand tall today. Any talk about Poe's life has to include his mysterious death. So he died in Baltimore on October 7th, 1849, at the age of 40. Theories about how he died have been disputed for forever. He was said to be delirious when he was found, basically laying in the gutter, and he was unable to ever explain what had happened to him when he died a few days after he was found. People say it's anything from murder to suicide, alcohol poisoning, to even crazy things like rabies or something called cooping, which was a form of voter fraud where you'd be grabbed off the street and given a ton of alcohol so that you couldn't think straight, and then you were forced to vote for a certain candidate in an election. And that's another theory as to what might have happened to Poe. Regardless of how he died, his works still stand the test of time today, and Edgar Allan Poe was born 212 years ago this week in history. This week in history, 248 years ago, January 17th, 1773, Captain James Cook became the first person to sail into the Antarctic Circle. In July 1772, Cook departed Great Britain aboard the HMS Resolution. This was his second journey. On his first journey, he had mapped out much of New Zealand and Australia, and he was commissioned to do this second journey not too long after he returned from the first. Cook became the person to travel furthest south of anyone in history, although he did not actually reach the mainland of Antarctica. It was on the 17th of January that he penetrated the Antarctic Circle. On this journey, he would actually cross into the circle 3 times total. The third time that he crossed in was the furthest south, but he ended up having to turn the ship back due to the weather and the sea ice. The journey was a success, and when he returned home to Britain in 1775, he was seen again as a conquering hero and was actually commissioned for a third exploratory trip. This one was not as lucky, though. This time, Cook went all the way out to Hawaii, and a cutter was stolen from one of his ships. In 1779, this was when this journey took place. Cook was murdered while attempting to kidnap Hawaii's monarch, Kalaniʻopuʻu. So the third voyage of Captain James Cook did not go as well. But this week in history, January 17th, 1773, Cook became the first man to sail into the Antarctic Circle. In pop culture, this week in history, 31 years ago, on January 21st, 1990, MTV's Unplugged show debuted. The show was recorded a couple of months earlier, but made its debut on this day on the network. It wasn't even called MTV Unplugged at the time. The band Squeeze was the main attraction of this one. If you don't know them, they've got a song Tempted and another Pulling Muscles from a Shell. If you listen to them, they're pretty good. It's incredible to think of the bands and the artists that came after, that they were the kind of the first to headline Unplugged. Over the years, bands like Kiss, Rod Stewart, Eric Clapton, Paul McCartney, 10,000 Maniacs, Jay-Z, and more have graced the stage of MTV Unplugged. But for me, as a child of the 80s, teenager of the 90s, being defined by grunge music as much as I was growing up, for me it was those bands when they played MTV Unplugged. Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, and for me especially Nirvana. That's the band that kind of defined me. I remember the Nirvana show in October 1993, and only after Kurt Cobain died in April 94, and then watching that show back, did I realize all the kind of funeral imagery of the set. The Pearl Jam show was actually the one that was first on MTV Unplugged, and I always got a kick out of it because I don't know if they were told, or Eddie Vedder was told, not to swear in any of the songs. There's a couple that have swears, especially from 10. When he does the song Porch, and it starts off with a swear, I won't say it. It's like he made this noise like he was swallowing it so he wouldn't say it. And then he scribbles on his arm with this marker. He writes pro-choice on his arm, or at least that's what he said he wrote. You couldn't really tell at the time. He just looked like he was insane, scribbling on himself. But that was kind of the feel of grunge. It was different. It was counterculture. I'll get way more into grunge as we go into this podcast. And there was also Alice in Chains, which I really enjoyed their set. That was one of their last shows, maybe their last show they ever did when that one came out on Unplugged. And I'll always remember Jerry Cantrell, the guitarist, had something scribbled on his guitar, and it said, "Friends don't let friends get haircuts." And it was because Metallica was sitting in the front row, and this was when they had all gotten the haircuts and got rid of their long hair. Only after the fact that I find that out. MTV Unplugged would kind of give way to a cousin on VH1, the VH1 Storytellers. They're very similar. It's a way to kind of cut through the noise and just hear what the music was about. And that's why with bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains that were seen as counterculture and loud alternative grunge, and you strip all that away and you see that they're super talented musicians, and that was kind of the big takeaway. Other ones like Clapton and Rod Stewart and Paul McCartney, they were all established already, so they really didn't need it. For these grunge bands, it really helped to establish them as more than just screaming, yelling, feedback. It all started this week in history 31 years ago with the premiere of MTV Unplugged. And that's going to do it for This Week in History. We'll have another one coming up next week. Hopefully you're enjoying these. As always, I don't gloss over these. I try to fit them in a time frame to make this a manageable segment and a manageable podcast. Obviously, there's more stuff that you can learn about all of these. There's research that I did. The FBI website can tell you all about the Brinks Robbery. Edgar Allan Poe has a website that has a huge, long biography, things like that. But definitely go out of your way to check out the Unplugged and learn as much as you can about history. It's my favorite subject, and I think that projects a little bit here. But I'll be back next week for more This Week in History.